So welcome here and welcome from at home online, whether you're on Zoom or YouTube. This is a really special event. This is our panel. I'll introduce them one by one, but first let me say something about the three of you together, because you share some characteristics. The one is everybody here other than me got ordained in the 1990s. So yes, yeah. So 1999, 1994, 1996. So these three people have all been practicing and making a commitment to practice the Dharma for a long, long time. And all three of these lovely people here have lived their lives very closely connected to the community of which we're part in various ways. A lot of experience in community living, in working together, in teaching the Dharma in various ways. So I think we're very, very lucky. And all three, obviously, because they're here, are concerned about the environment and our relationship with it, although in quite different ways and doing quite different things about it. So I'm hoping that this conversation will not just be a bunch of people agreeing with each other, but it'll be a real dialogue about what is the nature of the situation we're in, what can and should we do about it. So as Ratnaprabha said earlier on, but I'm not sure if we've heard it from at home, my name is Dhammamegha, and I'm the director of Windhorse Publications. And amongst other things, this is a fundraiser for Windhorse Publications, as you'll find out later. And we publish books on a variety of Dharmic topics. And two of our three panelists are authors, in fact, multiple authors. We've got some of their books here. Let's see. Whoopsie. Thank you. Small hands. There we go. So Vajragupta over there has published, let's see, Free Time, Wild Awake, amongst others, the Triratna Story, and Shantigarbha has published I'll Meet You There, and most recently, The Burning House, which is going to be part of this afternoon's event. So they're all people who've thought deeply about what we're doing. So Vajragupta is currently, amongst other things, the chair of the Croydon Buddhist Centre, and doing a lot of teaching and sort of building up that community. But you've had a long experience of institutional roles, chairs of other places, traveling to support sanghas, and writing on a range of topics, from foundational Buddhism, Buddhism Tools for Living Your Life is one of the go-to books if you want to get started, to much more detailed ones, including Wild Awake, which I'm sure you'll refer to today. You're right, Sarah. Maitridevi is the chair of Tara Local Buddhist Centre. So I'm hoping some of you in this room or online have been on retreat with you. And you have a special interest in, I suppose, imaginative and engaged ways of relating to yourself and the natural world. And you might know was leading a series of meditations with trees during coronavirus that I know I found very helpful, and others have found very helpful. And Shantigarbha is has sort of two hats in a way, your environmental activist hat, and you're the one of the panel who kind of actively considers yourself an environmental activist, who's very involved in Extinction Rebellion, and tying that in with work on non-violent communication. So how to do social movement activity in a way that is deeply, deeply rooted in non-violence and the Buddhist principles of interdependence, I suppose. And Shantigarbha runs a consultancy with Christina, who's here, called Seeds of Peace. So, and order convening, yes, indeed. Order convening, so there's various organizations that, Triratna is a very global movement that seek to meet together at sort of a global level. So we're one of the link people between the EU and the rest, and Europe and the rest of the world. Yeah. So today, what we've got for the next 2 hours planned is I've got sort of three little headings in in my head. The first is it all began under a tree. And if we think about the Buddha's birth, the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha's death, it was under a tree. And I suppose one of the questions is, how do we individually relate to the natural world? How do we practice in relation to the natural world? So we've got some questions and things to talk about that. The second theme is like, what actually is the problem? And what is a Buddhist response? Or a Buddhist way of thinking about the nature of the problem? And is there a Buddhist way of thinking about solutions to the problem of the ways we relate to the environment and what we're doing in relation to the environment at the moment? So that's a sort of second theme. Somewhere in the middle of that, we'll have a tea break, because we have bodies. And then the third theme is sort of, what do we do? What do you want to do? What are the possibilities for action, and how do we think about acting in ways that are wise and compassionate and integrated? So those are the themes. It's not just me that's going to be asking questions. I'm sort of hoping we'll end up with a humdinger of the panel talking to each other, and there'll be times when I'll stop that and ask for questions from you and from you online as well. So there'll be some room for participation. But we have an extraordinary amount of experience in the panel, and I'd like us to see how far we can go in our conversations with each other. So let's go back to number one, which is all starts under a tree, and how do we experience ourselves, not just in relation to nature, but as parts of nature. And I've asked Maitridevi to lead us in a meditation to begin our discussions today. So over to you, Maitridevi.
So we're just going to have a short 10-minute sit and just find a bit of connection between ourselves and each other in the world, perhaps. So just make yourselves comfortable wherever you are. Find that stability of the ground beneath you. Maybe take a few deeper breaths. Let the belly fill and release as you breathe. Let the skin of the face soften a little, if it will. Perhaps just let the breath be normal, easy, and a sense of releasing down through the legs and into the earth as you breathe out. Maybe a little sense of the energy coming up from the earth as you breathe in. So we'll just connect downwards for a few moments. Whatever stability there is beneath you, that is the earth under you. And she is vast, imperturbable, stable. So perhaps a sense of how energy can flow from the pelvis and down through the legs, rooting into earth. There's a sort of infinite depth beneath us. And it maybe echoes an infinite depth in our psyches. There's an infinite depth to our being. Just allowing your awareness to trace the breathing length of your body from the earth, from the roots, up through the length of your body to the neck, the skull, crown of the head. Just a sense of the crown grazing the sky above you. So there's vast, infinite space above. And we're touching into that. Just let that infinite space above be echoed in the mind, in the heart. There's also an infinity within us. So just absorbing some of that spacious, vast sky into your being. And just like a tree with our roots and crown, there's also the heartwood and trunk, center point in our being. This meeting of earth and sky and this immense sensitivity, this immense aliveness. And with this sensitivity, a sensitive heart, there's always a sort of woundedness, there's a sort of brokenness. And there's also a feeling for and with life. Maybe just sensing all around the aliveness of beings around you, the aliveness of this planet. Perhaps we can imagine the heart as being the planet feeling itself to be alive. That's what it's like. So we're just finding our place with earth, sky, and life, like all other living beings. like trees. It's like the mythic world tree, the Bodhi tree. Just let this be a place of awakening. Where else will it happen? Yeah, that feels better. I really love that bit when you were saying the experience of the heart is the awareness of the world, the awareness of earth. I wonder if we can turn to you, Vajragupta. You wrote a whole book about being wild awake. I think it was alone, offline, and in nature. Why is that important?
Well, maybe I could start with a quote from John Muir, who was he was one of the pioneers of the American conservation movement. And he once said something like, "I decided to go out for a walk, and then I decided to stay out." Oh, no, I just went out for a walk, and then I decided to stay out till sundown, because going out, I found, was really going in. Going out was really going in. So I think that's what it can be like to be in nature. You go out into the world, you go out into nature and the beauty of it, and it draws you out. You find yourself sort of, from maybe the kind of scrunched up, heady state that you've been in, you find yourself unfold into the world, going out. And at the same time, that takes you into yourself. And somehow the two aren't different. Somehow, you're sort of unfolded into the world in a way that you can really be more fully in the world, but you can also be more fully in and yeah, that's definitely been my experience of being in nature, and, particularly being alone in nature, particularly being in solitary retreat in nature. And yeah, so you just open to so much beauty. So I would say some of my happiest experiences in life, the times that I'll maybe remember when I'm on my deathbed, those moments, there've been some of those moments in nature where one goes out, but also at the same time goes in.
What's the difference between, say, going on a nature walk as anybody going on a nature walk and being a Buddhist on a solitary retreat in its ways?
Well, maybe it doesn't have to be a difference. Everybody, many people love nature, don't they?
Yeah.
I'll tell you a story actually. So, one of the things people love about nature is those magical times when you have an encounter with the wild animals. sometimes, you know, you meet a deer or a fox and you're face to face and you're just looking at each other. And those are really magical moments. And again, you're just gazing at this other creature, and at the same time you're thrown back on yourself and you realise, oh, I'm a human being. There's another kind of creature. And it's definitely alive, and it's definitely aware, and it's looking at me, but it's a different kind of aliveness. And those moments are very, very special. But when you talk about those kind of stories, you know, as I do in the book, while I'm at work, of course what happens is other people have had those, and people love telling those stories. So I remember once, you know, on occasion, some friends together, and we just got talking about that kind of thing. And there was a guy there who he said, I want to tell you my story. And he'd actually been on the streets, lived on the streets for a few years. You know, his life had gone wrong. He hit the bottle, and he ended up living on the streets. And one night he was sleeping in a churchyard. You know, churchyards sometimes have those gates, kind of roofed gates. That's where he was. And a fox came along. And he just sat there very still looking at the fox. And the fox looked at him, came a little bit closer. Just stayed there looking at the fox. The fox came a bit closer, and he said, eventually, our noses touched.
Wow.
I felt the kind of wet cold of his nose. And the thing was, when he said that, he was so moved. You could tell he was going to remember that for the rest of his life. It's such a kind of magical moment, which we can all. I mean, I think maybe there's something about being alone in nature, which is perhaps makes that kind of experience more alive. So Annie Dillard talks about that. She's a very well-known nature writer. And she talks about when she loves being with friends in nature. She says there's always something kind of psychically going on between you. Even if you agree, let's just be quiet and see what happens. You're sort of thinking, are they all right? Or would they rather I was talking to them? And she says the animals pick up on that. And they don't come so close. She finds it's when she's on her own in nature that those really close-up encounters can happen more often. Sure, there are exceptions, but yeah, for me, there's a particular value about being in nature. Although, of course, it's also lovely to share it with others. You know, they're not mutually exclusive.
You've been basically trying to, well, maybe you can say a little bit about what you've been doing at Tyaloka, in a way, trying to facilitate a space of encounter and connection.
Yes, I don't know whether I've succeeded yet. It's more trying to work out how do I lead retreats that create that space of encounter. And of course you're not necessarily alone to create a sort of collective sensitivity to what's out there. I was thinking of something a bit different actually from those magical encounters, and it was more to do with vulnerability, the experience of vulnerability in relationship to nature. And this is where you touch into things like inconvenience and loss of control. And so we had because of COVID, we had a marquee up at Tyaloka, leading retreats in a marquee, which is standard Buddhafield. But we had thunderstorms the week I was doing, torrential rain, and there's just this experience of going to the marquee and having no idea at any moment whether you might have to abandon the whole session at any point and completely improvise. And it was true for me, it was true for the rest of the team, it was true for the entire retreat. And I think that had an effect on everybody, like it freed something up because we weren't in control, and in a way we were completely at the mercy of the thunder and the rain. In a way, like here, like you can control the noise and the temperature, and it does a certain something to you, doesn't it? It changes your understanding of what you are in relation to the world. In other words, untroubled and a bit disconnected, as opposed to in the middle of and really affected by, and in a way dependent and vulnerable too. So I suppose there's that I'm kind of interested in, is like, you know, of course with control goes comfort and ease. So there's this, we always want to go towards comfort and ease and away from maybe those sorts of experiences of nature that reveal how frail we are. Yeah, so something about that, I think. It'd be good to explore practice generally.
In terms of our relationship to the earth?
Well, in this particular way, sort of practicing in contexts and situations, or putting yourself in conditions of encounter.
I guess I spend quite a bit of time sailing in the summer, and it's not the usual kind of image of of nature, but it's very salutary lessons that you learn from being on a small boat on a big sea. And you get a sense of the scale of things, very different sense of scale, and the power of the elements, basically. The power of the elements, and that you need a good plan, or else you need a very good plan, as in a boat, or you need you need plans for bad weather. It might be very easy sometimes, might be very sort of beautiful and peaceful and calm. Other times you're in fear of your life, and you need to be careful to keep your life. I like to go there to get a sense of scale. So it's easy to think that nature is kind of picture postcard and beautiful sunsets and things like that, but there is also a kind of a raw, sort of elemental aspect to nature as well.
I come from a place that isn't quite as physically domesticated as this, and I remember doing a 1 month retreat, and there was a cobra that had made a home just between, there was sort of a little hole in the rocks in the steps to where I was staying, and I've never been so concentrated in my entire life, because particularly in the evening it was quite dark and I have to walk and I couldn't quite see what was going on, so I was very, very aware. But I think there is something, I was thinking about this, for those of you who are here and living in London, it's one thing to, you're living in Taraloka, like it's one thing to be in a space where you are exposed, put yourself in a situation where you are exposed. And I'm thinking about that in terms of, well, technically it's called conceit, isn't it? In Buddhist views, the sort of self-clinging, that in which control is one of the ways in which we secure ourselves as sort of separate and like we can sort of kid ourselves that we're not vulnerable, that we're not subject to, well, that we're not, and therefore don't become receptive. We're often so controlling and organizing and arranging and everything, but actually we're subject. We have to learn to be receptive to experience of our bodies, of the environment. So I'm wondering if there's any, or maybe even some questions from you about, like, you live in London. How is it that you manage to live in a world that's kind of bigger than the human scale organization of our lives? Yes, we've got to do microphone things. I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts or questions or stories. No, that's okay. Yeah, it is a bit intimidating.
And I don't know whether this happens in London, but something that happens that just struck me, my response to it struck me was when we opened in June, the first event we had was an order weekend. We had about 20 women, and on, I think, the first evening, we had a note over from the community saying the water's off. There's no water, we don't know when it's coming back on again. We had no notice, and there was no, there were no kettles, there's nothing, we had no spare water, and someone had gone out and bought a few litre bottles of water, and that was it. And I remember just being really cross and thinking, this is crazy, we've got a retreat, it's like you can't just, we need water. And I was, and then I went to bed and thought about it, and I thought, well, I'm angry at this sort of outrageousness and the inconvenience of not having water when we can't cope without it. And actually, it's like, we're so vulnerable. Like, if water's not available for a day, a couple of days, we're in really big trouble. And I never experienced that. And then I'm just angry when I have to, when there it is, that's what's happened, and how outrageous in this world. And I just, I suppose I thought, well, so much for 6 element practice, is reflecting the necessity of water and air. You know, it's like suddenly
I guess
notice
that's
what happens when it's not there.
it's a 6 element practice in real life.
Yes,
isn't it?
yes. I wasn't quite
Yeah.
nailing it.
Yeah, maybe that was your first response, but often what happens after that, it does bring people together, doesn't it? Like when you're talking about the marquee, I've had that experience. And actually, when it rains on an event like that, people can kind of band together because of what's going on.
Yeah.
That really interesting experience.
Yeah, so it creates community and a relationship with the environment that you don't otherwise get. It's quite interesting. Yeah.
Kind of drawn out into more connection than you might otherwise have been.
And you get a sense of, I think you have to get a sense of spontaneity because you want to control it, and then you get a sense of play. And you can also get joy and delight coming out of that. It's quite, that process is fascinating.
And yet we're so often trying to not get into that space.
Yeah.
Prevent ourselves from being in a space of not knowing what's going on.
What if you had to improvise? I mean, that's what we do now.
I mean, I've been wondering whether we should be doing more retreats like this. You know, it has been a bit in the air again, hasn't it? Like the Buddha field theme this year was Kiss the Earth, and maybe they would say we've been doing this for years, but I wonder whether at the other retreat centre there's a potential. It sounds like we're doing it to some extent. Even things like Buddhist vision quests and like really going into nature and making those discoveries.
Yeah, I was wondering about the vision quests, trying to work out how we could do that in Florida.
Into the peat bog with you.
Yeah.
A hole in the peat bog.
Yeah. But that is, yes, well, it has happened. I mean, not the, like, I mean, in a way, there's a sort of slight edge of ordeal, but not ordeal in an awful sense, but in a way that challenge, which you also get with ordination as well, don't you? There's a sort of, it's like, are you going to face what you need to face? Yeah, are you going to face what you need to face?
Chrissy?
Yes, do I need to get the mic?
Maybe speak loudly.
Okay. Sorry, a bit late, but you did ask us. And
yeah.
I'm not sure if it's a question, it's a reflection, but you were talking about control, ease, inconvenience, and all that. And I spent summer in Greece. I'm from Greece, and obviously we had a lot of wildfires there. Across the country, at some point, 138 fires. 2 of them I experienced very close to home. The temperature went up to 45 degrees. You couldn't do much other than stay indoors and put the aircon on and then create more of climate change out there. But there you go. So what I experienced there was a very different kind of fear. It's not the fear that you experience in everyday life when something happens, like death, disease. It was a very primal fear, very hard to put into words and very hard to communicate with people. So I guess that was the reflection. And in terms of the question, I guess, how do you then connect with people on that? Like coming back to London, it feels very hard to share that experience. And I guess that's an important question to me because my job is in campaigns and talking about climate change and how it affects farmers in developing countries. So how do you pass that message and then connect with people in a meaningful way? I don't think I have found that. So any kind of reflection, that would be appreciated.
So there's a lot in that question, isn't it? Maybe we can start with the fear part. Maybe. I wonder if anyone wants to talk. Because presumably when you're, say, for example, leading retreats or you're teaching the Dharma, obviously we sort of get a little bit undone in the process of our Dharma life, and rightly so. So quite often fear can come up. How do you work with that, well, ourselves and also in this experience of vulnerability?
What's coming up for me is, am I safe in myself? That might sound surprising, but am I actually safe in my connection with myself, my sense of my sort of compassion, as it were, towards myself? am I going to look after myself in a healthy way? Am I going to sort of be here for myself in the face of these challenges, whether it's wildfires or the climate and ecological emergency? So that's a kind of self-connection, self-compassion. I think it's crucial. And of course, it does bring up a lot of fear, fear and grief and all sorts of other things, anger. So I would say, what we do in meditation, an important aspect of that is self-connection, sort of self-compassion. It's how we speak to ourselves, that voice, and finding a different way to speak to ourselves that is as compassionate as we want to be to the world and to other people. Start there.
It's interesting that I think one of the first records of the Buddha teaching the Metta-bhavana and the Metta Sutta was in response to some monks who were in a state of fear. So they'd gone somewhere to meditate, and there were these tree spirits who were disturbed by them being there. So they were trying to frighten the monks, who were frightened, and they went to the Buddha. And that's what he taught them, Metta-bhavana. So yeah, metta for self and metta for the tree spirits as well. Yeah. So,
and then another aspect is just recognizing that, well, life is a risky business. It's a risky business being alive. It's not necessarily comforting and easy. There are risks to do with just walking down the street. Sort of having a body is a risky business. So just kind of acknowledging that. Everything that can be lost will be lost. To put it bluntly. Sorry about that.
It is true.
It is true. It is also true. It's a virtue of being true. Yes.
Well, it's interesting. It's
Sorry, they're kind of quite difficult to hear.
okay.
So I'm going to ask you just to hold the microphone,
Okay.
but hold it very gently at the end.
Okay.
And pass it between you.
So I think it's here. It's okay.
Yep. Actually, I'll hold it for you, shall I? Very gently while you finish off with.
I think
life
I said
is
it.
A risky. Do you want to say it? Say
I
that
think I
again,
said it.
Maybe.
Everything that can be lost will be lost. It's a poem by Jennifer Wellwood called "The Darkening Speaks" about impermanence, about the risks. That we can't. There's no such thing as a safe passage. And trying to bargain for a safe passage, isn't going to get us anywhere, unfortunately. So recognizing impermanence, to put it in Dharma terms, recognizing that impermanence and insubstantiality. Really recognizing that those are real. That nothing that we can do can alter those.
It reminds me a little bit of the story of the 4 sights with the Buddha, and it's sort of unbelievable that Buddha had never heard of illness or death before, but it's sort of one of those moments when he really got it. I think that the 4 sights of seeing somebody who was sick, seeing somebody who was very old, seeing somebody who was dying, like we see that all the time, and then suddenly it comes close, and then we really see it and sort of have to take on board. With compassion, as you say, like the fact of that, the significance of that.
Yeah. Yes, I'm interested in what Vajragupta was saying about metta, and also what you're saying, Shantigarbha, about there's no such thing as a safe passage, isn't there? And just this tendency that we have to. You apologise when you said that, to shy away, even as Buddhists, to shy away from those sort of realities and back into this sheltered world, and how we can take up spiritual practice as a way of, in a way, trying to get out of the bind, rather than facing the existential situation, trying to sort of get out of it in some way. And so it just brings me back to these words like vulnerability and tenderness and heart and connection and and grief, and that sometimes we need to learn to be willing to soften into that and acknowledge to ourselves that we are in, life is complex and inevitably difficult, and we don't get what we want, and we will lose everything. And so be willing to sort of move into that. I wonder whether we keep sort of wanting to soften things a little bit and reassure us. In a way, in some ways you need to reassure yourself to calm down sort of levels of anxiety, but in other ways we need to sort of face it a little bit more, don't we? it's just interesting. I was thinking about the people, people in North America talking about that heat wave when you were talking about Greece, and that just like, I think again and again I heard people saying this is awful, this is not fun, as if, that sense that they hadn't clocked what it was like until it happened, and we don't clock what it's like. We don't clock what it's like, that we really don't have any control over the weather, and it's fine as long as the weather's fairly sort of temperate. And we just don't imagine, we don't let ourselves imagine what it would be like to be, in fear for your life, to lose everything, your home, Anyway.
Thank you. I'll take this off for a moment. It's really just using your comments, which I find really, really helpful as a springboard for sort of the next question. Because what I was thinking about with your question, Chrissy, was about, the first steps on the spiral path, how you go from dukkha to faith. And I was thinking as you were speaking, Shantigarbha and Maitridevi, what you're saying is absolutely correct. But I think, the greater danger in the world, well, certainly kind of thinking myself and around me, is there's the kind of the nihilist position is stopping there, it's all a disaster, we're all going to die, the planet is screwed, and how do we use those reflections and really being with and facing that, our kind of fear, our frailty, as a springboard to deeper response, rather than just becoming really overwhelmed with horrified anxiety. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think, as you say, more and more people, just by virtue of our conditions, are coming face to face with that vulnerability. But then, how do we transform it into a meaningful response in the kind of informed by the Dharma? Yeah.
That's really interesting. You mentioning dukkha and faith, so the sense of unsatisfactoriness and imperfection, and then the faith in another possibility. And it's really interesting, those two come first, isn't it? Because you need both of those. Yeah, in a way we're saying we need to face the situation and be really honest about the situation, and there might be a tendency to want to kind of hide away from it. But then it's also really, really important to have a vision, isn't it? And a sense of another possibility. And without that, you're lost. And so that's the kind of faith dimension. Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say. Perhaps I'll come back in a moment.
Yeah.
I think so.
Thank you. So a couple of things there. One is how to deal with, or how to address. Comes up. How to be with fear and anguish. Well, what I would say, particularly in relation to the climate and ecological emergency, we need to create some space for grief, as has been mentioned previously. There's going to be some grief coming up. In fact, any time that I go to a Buddhist centre and start talking about this stuff, people say they're feeling sad about the world that we're passing on to future generations. So I think it's important just to acknowledge that sadness in a way, and give some space to it, not to try and do anything with it, but just let it be, as it were, and kind of acknowledge it. And, so I'll just wait for about 5 seconds there, just to give a little bit of space for that. And at some point, we may make a connection between our grief and our love for the earth, and our care for the earth, and our wish to protect the earth. At some point, that may come up. We may kind of touch in that sense of sadness and grief. We may touch on our love for the earth and our care for the earth. And in fact, our grief is a measure of our love for the earth and our care for the earth, and our wish to protect this and future generations, and to make sure that the opportunities that we've had, the richness of life and the wonder of life, to make sure that those opportunities are also available for future generations as well. So I would say those are the connections that I'm sort of make when I sort of sit with groups of people and we look at this. We look at this topic. And the other thing I would say more practically is there's a great antidote to fear and anxiety and grief. Well, fear and anxiety, which is action, doing something it makes a tremendous difference. Whatever role you choose for yourself, actually doing something, even if it's infinitesimal in relation to the scale of the issues, to have a sense that you're actually doing something and working with people who are also doing something, whatever that may be, that's actually a wonderful tonic, I would say, to that sort of overwhelming sense of anxiety and sort of grief.
Sort of antidote to nihilism is showing that something can be done by doing something.
That's right, and celebrating the people who are doing things, who are taking action in different ways, whatever that may be.
So I think before we get there will be a chance to talk about what to do. But in a way, I think before we get there, I'm kind of interested in the idea of view and right view. So I think we've already spoken about it a little bit in what you were both saying, actually, about sort of facing up to the facts of the world and our own vulnerability and the fact that everything cannot be in control. I suppose one of the foundational issues with the Noble Eightfold Path is basically right view. How can we understand both the problems and the human condition in a way that can help us, support us to face that, and sort of in a way, that's another way of asking what would be a Buddhist response to environmental action. Is there something in the Dharma that we can draw on? And I was just reading last night again a little bit in Living with Awareness by Sangharakshita, when he starts talking about animism and the nature of life itself. And I'm wondering if we can talk about that a little bit before we move on to the what to do, if you like. And I wonder if one of you would like to. Yeah.
Hold the microphone right at the end. Yes, I suppose, just thinking about what Sangharakshita says in Living with Awareness, it's a very good chapter. It's worth reading. It's on the elements. And in a way, what I understand him to be pointing out is that we have we're constantly sort of working with a dualistic framework. And one, me and the rest of the world is one way of thinking about it. But we have other boundaries that we put in place, such as alive and not alive. And in talking about the elements, it's like he's suggesting we start pushing on that view about alive and not alive, when given that what we are is a flow through of elements, and we absolutely don't exist without that dynamic flowing relationship. Out comes in and in goes out, and there is no life without that. So in what sense in what way does it make sense to draw a line between living being, non-living elemental world, when life is utterly dependent upon and part of this elemental world, and also the elemental world life seems to emerge from it. There seems to be some sort of way in which the element wills itself, the elemental world wills itself into life in some extraordinary and mysterious way we don't understand. And I think if we allow ourselves to start thinking like that, there's perfectly good reasons why you can think in terms of me and you, living and non-living. Intuitively, that makes sense and it works for certain ways of being. And I think we need other modes of thinking and imagining which allow, to be part of a living whole, which call forth different attitudes. And I think when you start to allow for things to be alive, then you start to have ethical duties towards them. You start to have relationship. You start to have areas around respect. So then you have to start thinking, how do I live respectfully and kindly in relation to the whole? So I just think it offers a different way that is worth exploring.
Yeah, thank you. If I can just throw something else in, but I think it does
eventually kind of connect to that. So it's another quote from Sangharakshita in the Survey of Buddhism, so in a way one of his early works. And I won't get it right word for word, but he says something like there's two basic approaches to life. One is that you can try and fit the world and change the world to suit your desires. And the other approach to life is that you can change your desires to fit the world. And for me, in a way, that sort of gets to the nub of the matter, that basically we've had thousands and thousands of years of human beings, in a way, getting better and better at manipulating the world, changing the world to suit their desires. And it doesn't work. Yeah, that's the nature of samsara, the kind of the problem with samsara. But what it does is it solves one problem and it creates other problems. That's just been ratcheted up and up and up now for thousands of years, to the point where, apparently we're in danger of destroying ourselves and the planet. Yeah. So yeah, there are these two basic approaches to life. So one is kind of samsaric. It kind of perpetuates samsara, and it also kind of tends towards the power mode, to kind of using things to suit our own desires. And the other is, you could say, it's nirvanic. It's the love mode. It's kind of changing our desires to meet the world. And I think what that does, the more you're able to live like that, it's not like you're diminished. It's like you love. You open out into the world. You become more connected. You become more alive. I.e., it links to animism. Do you see what I mean? You become more alive, and the world becomes more alive. Yeah. So for me, this view of Sangharakshita is about animism. Well, that's what he says in Living with Awareness. He says it's not just some added-on thing. He says you get all these stories about spirits and things in the Pali Canon. That's not just a sort of added-on thing. It's absolutely kind of integral to the message. And when I remember first reading that chapter, and then he says, I would go so far as to say as there's no possibility in gaining enlightenment in a universe conceived of as dead. I found it really sort of a bit enigmatic and very intriguing, and it really kind of made me think, what's he kind of getting at? And this is what I think he's getting at, that that's what enlightenment is. It's living in that mode where the aliveness in you and the aliveness in the universe are not separate, they're not different. Yeah. That's the kind of the choice that we're making at every moment in our own lives, and that's the choice that's now facing humanity in a very, very big way indeed. Yeah.
So how do you become an animist? Because I was struck by a Buddhist animist, yeah. But I was struck by what you were saying, like that lovely thing that Sangharakshita says, that you can either try and fix the world to meet your desires, or you change your desires. Like, how do you change your desires? How do you change your view of the world? Because in a way, that's all, a lot of that is received, isn't it? Like, we've received our view of the world, what we have the capacity to experience and not experience in our upbringing, in our cultural conditioning. So if we're trying to engage in a work of becoming more sensitive, being more able to live in a way that's both loving and vulnerable, then sort of how? You've got.
I can respond
Yeah.
something just briefly. So, I guess one way is to do the 4-element practice, or the 6-element practice. Down a bit, okay. Yeah. So to get as has been said earlier, to get a visceral sense of the elements in our body, and that we are part of, we're part of the earth is part of us. So, and to do that even moment by moment, just to remember earth element, water elements, blood, saliva, all that kind of thing, air element, breathing in, breathing out. And that's just a constant exchange, so we don't have to go anywhere special in order to experience that sense of, of being elemental, of being totally elemental. And just remembering, as Vajragupta said, remembering that if we buy into that thing that the universe is dead and we're just these sort of alive blobs, in a basically inert universe, if we've bought into that, it's almost impossible to imagine gaining enlightenment with that kind of dualistic mindset. So in a way that gives an idea of how far we've gone, or most of us have gone, towards a nihilistic sort of mindset or dualistic mindset. Yeah. But basically, once you're dead, you're dead. That's it, you know. So it was well worth reflecting on that, you know, and seeing what you can do to redress the balance, I could say. Yeah.
It's a very different way of understanding things, like as opposed to where we started, in a way, like I'm over here encountering nature, to like all things in nature, including what I conceive of as myself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose this question of like, how do you become animist has been on my mind probably the last year. And one thing I was thinking is noticing when that's completely not the state that I'm working from. So it's quite interesting for me just to stop myself, like right now. How am I relating to this space that I'm in? How are you relating to, you know, I mean, whether it's we've got, you know, I suddenly thought, oh, we've got this amazing fig plant there. You know, it's like we've got the walls, we've got the floor, we've got the light coming through the window here. We've got, as well as all of us. And in a way, it's like, how do you let yourself experience those things right now? And it's possible to move from something quite functional and utilitarian to a sort of appreciative interest, an aesthetic appreciation, and there sort of starts to be a sort of, oh, I've got one behind here. So it's, you know, and start to be interested. And I was just sitting this morning, and there's a plant outside the room I was staying in, and in a way I was thinking about this, do I relate to this room I'm in as alive? And there was this plant outside the window, and I sort of suddenly started just noticing it, noticing the way it moved, noticing the sort of like the fullness of it. It was so exuberant. And it's a bit like you were saying, Vajragupta, you know, you start noticing, you go out into nature and it starts speaking to you. So then you start to sort of, in a way, come into relationship. Like, and we see, like, you can get little teachings, you know, looking at the light coming through the plants outside the window, you know, this an illumination coming through the leaves. You can start to sort of actually start to occupy a different space. You start to occupy a different room, and we just flip it. You can flip into that and out of that, and in a way, maybe we just need to remember, I think you have to be quiet for a bit. I think you have to be prepared to sit still for a bit, not to distract yourself, and then maybe ask that question.
Yeah, just to add to that, at the risk of sounding like a bunny hugger, I've been wondering about doing, well, it's good actually, isn't it? Let's be proud. Yeah. I've been thinking about doing the metta bhavana for things, which is, in a way, that's what you've been talking about. So as well as doing the metta bhavana for human beings, maybe doing the metta bhavana for other animals and creatures, but even plants and even everything. And actually in the Metta Sutta, although it's mainly about metta directed to other beings, it does say pervade the whole world or the whole cosmos with metta. Sort of, there's a little reference which you could take in that way. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you a little story. Again, maybe, I don't know, I feel slightly embarrassed, it's going to sound silly, but so I'm living in a house where there's a garden that's gone wild and it's a bit of a mess. It's just been neglected for years. And I can sometimes look out the window and just feel dismay, and it's, you know, it's just a mess. And I get into a slight state of aversion where I just want to go out and destroy it and just get rid of it and start again. And then sometimes I've been thinking, no, I need to do the metta bhavana for the garden. I need to do the metta for those plants and think, what's it like for them? You know, what's it like for them to be sort of choked up with bindweed and brambles, and what's it like for the brambles? And then it does actually change something. You start to sort of imagine how you could work with that in a different way, which is different for you, but also might bring about a different garden. You know, rather than just going out, this does not suit what I want, and I'm going to change it. Mode, as it were. Yeah. So I think, yeah, like you were saying, aesthetic appreciation and metta. Yeah, really bringing loving kindness to bear on everything. Yeah, as much as we can.
That's not happiness, you talk about
belongs to existence itself.
So I think people wouldn't have heard that at home. Do you mind if I just say that's all right? No, that's all right. What's your name?
My name's JC.
JC's just been talking about like that's all very well on an individual level, but actually we're also in a collective situation in which there is a strong urge to destruction, say, and that we have to engage with it not only on the sort of individual level, but also the collective. And of course, that's a really interesting question. It's not just a whole bunch of individuals that make up a collective. There's also a culture of the collective that's beyond individuals.
So your initial feeling, that doesn't leave something that's all destructive.
So I'm wondering, just in terms of a sort of change, if you like, in our discussion from the individual to the collective, whether now's a good time to take a little bit of a break. Back from tea break. We're due to finish in half an hour. So I feel like we've been sort of a bit in a process, haven't we, of getting quieter and more sensitive, hopefully, and thinking about how we think. And I think, Jay, your question is about, like, what do we do collectively? So maybe we can turn it around a little bit after our break and say, well, what do we do? Like, what can we do that is appropriate, I suppose, relevant and wise to the scale of the problem that we're in? And to try and tackle that question, we're going to go over to Shantigarbha.
Okay, thank you. So what to do? So who's come across the parable of the burning house from the White Lotus Sutra? It's about slightly more than half. Okay, so the parable of the burning house gives some idea of where we might look or what we might do. The parable of the burning house is a father who has up to 30 children, who lives in a really old, huge old mansion, ramshackle mansion. And he comes home one day and he finds that this mansion is on fire, okay? And it's burning away merrily, the roof beams are burning, the whole thing's collapsing, and then a neighbor tells him, oh, your children are playing in the house, okay? So, of course, he's kind of terrified by this. So immediately he yells out to the children. He says, the house is on fire, come out. Get out as quickly as you can. And of course, they take absolutely no notice of him. They just carry on playing with their toys, okay? The toys that they have. They're quite happy with those toys, thank you very much. So they just carry on playing. So now he really doesn't know what to do because he's tried the obvious thing. So, but he has a moment, a flash of inspiration. And this I think is going to be useful for us. He has a flash of inspiration, and he knows what kind of toys his children really like. He knows that this child loves this particular toy, and these children like these toys. So he yells out again. He says, "There are some wonderful toys out here, some amazing toys, even better than the ones you're playing with at the moment, even better than the ones on TV, and you can play with them till bedtime." Okay? And of course, once he says this, then the children fight each other to get out of the house. They sort of jostle and push each other to see who can get out of the house first. So this is the parable of the burning house. Now, parables are useful because they can help us to think creatively about problems which seem completely intractable on their own level. Yeah, and parables work on a number of different levels. So one level for this parable is that the house in the parable is, it's on fire. Now, in the Buddhist context, the flames are greed, hatred, and delusion. Okay? So that's the fire. That's the fire of samsara. So you mentioned greed, you mentioned, hatred. People seem to have this destructive urge. Well, that's hatred. And of course, those poisons, as they're called, have been institutionalized in our culture. You know, we've got greed, we've got, well, the whole advertising industry promoting consumption, you know, promoting high carbon lifestyle. We've got hatred, well, we've got the whole kind of military industrial complex and governments that are basically in support of the military industrial complex in different ways. And also we've got delusion. Well, what would be delusion? I don't know, maybe the media. I don't know, you take your pick, you know, but we've basically, those are institutionalized. So, so they are writ large, okay, in our life, in our cultural life. So we've got the burning house of greed, hate, the flames are greed, hatred, and delusion. Then we've got the climate and ecological emergency. What are the flames that are burning that? What do you reckon? Yeah, but what are the flames? I would suggest that the flames are the same, exactly the same. You know, as you mentioned, greed, hatred, and delusion. That, you know, you can argue that we didn't know about what we were doing. I think it turns out that the fossil fuel companies knew what they were doing a long time ago and suppressed the information. So, you know, there is willful ignorance there, as it were, as in the sense of ignoring the issues. Yeah. So where am I going with this? So we've got this parable, and in the parable, the cry of anguish didn't work. Okay, the cry of anguish didn't work. So telling people, you know, we're all going to die, get out of the house, save yourself, save others. It has very, very limited impact. Very, very limited impact, I'm afraid to say. People have been doing it for like 30 years. It's had pretty minimal impact. If you look at the, you know, the graphs of emissions, they've just continued to rise, you know, sort of, in fact, increasingly. Then we have this, what I would call a cry of inspiration. So then then the father looks at his children, you know, realizes the kind of thing that would get them out of the house, and then tells them, you're going to get this if you come out of the house. So we need some kind of cry of inspiration that's going to, I'm pretty sure is going to be more effective than a cry of anguish, even though sometimes you need a bit of a cry of anguish there as well to perhaps to get people's attention. So what could be our equivalent cry of inspiration? What could be our you know, vision of life outside the burning house that would be sufficient to get people out? It doesn't have to be more than that. It just needs to be sufficient to get them out of the house, and then we can have a conversation about where we go next. So what I like about this is it helps me to think creatively about this issue rather than get stuck down, rather than sort of get bogged down in the, you know, the details of it. Yeah.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask, so and for those of you who are going to be in the afternoon session, it's going to be based on this book, which is called The Burning House, which sort of draws out the implications of that and this question of inspiration. I think in terms of what we're talking about now, all of us do something in some way, in various ways, in attempting to respond to the situation. And you, in particular, have been working with Extinction Rebellion and in a variety of ways. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit of what you do and why, and we can then open it up. I'm just aware of the time that we can open up to investigating options, say.
Yeah. So I started in 2019 working with the non-violence and de-escalation team in Extinction Rebellion. So this is bringing non-violent discipline into actions and maintaining non-violent discipline and de-escalating things when tension arises. So basically, I was using my skills as a non-violent communication trainer and mediator in one-to-one situations and large crowd situations. And there's some stories in the book about when we tried that and when it worked, and sometimes when it didn't work so well, but at least we had a go, at least we tried. And then more recently, I've been involved in Extinction Rebellion Buddhists, because I wanted a bit of a quieter gig this time around. So we do walking meditation, we do sitting meditation, and we sort of bring a kind of calming, kind of grounding element to what otherwise can be quite fraught and intense and even distressing situations. So those are the two ways that I've been involved.
And your involvement is of direct action, kind of explicitly at a political level, explicitly around policy, for example, and also interrupting various processes.
Yeah, so I see there's a role for non-violent disruption. Now, I think I'd like to suggest we all take this very seriously, because if we don't deal with this now, it will get worse. All the issues will get dramatically worse. All the social problems around those will get dramatically worse, and it will get violent, and the protests will get violent as well. This is my prediction. So I recommend we put all our efforts into non-violent disruption and non-violent protest, because otherwise, historically, if you look at these kind of issues, violence will ensue, of one kind or another.
Wondering if
I like the way you discuss this in your book, the non-violent direct action. You quoted that quote from Sangharajtan. I thought it was a very intelligent discussion the way you did it. But I'd just like to say a couple of things. So I'm not against non-violent direct action in all cases, but I've got reservations about it. So one reservation is that I think we've seen recently that democracy is very fragile. We saw that with the American election, didn't we? We can think certain countries are the kind of bastions of democracy, and actually it turns out it's very, very fragile. So that's just a kind of a caution that if people break the law on one side to make their point, it's then very easy for things to escalate and people to break the law on the other side, and you can undermine democracy. So I think any kind of action like that, you just need to be aware of that and careful around that. And I suppose I'm very, very cautious about actions which target ordinary people. So, for example, people blocking the M25. You go on the M25 and you stop the traffic. That's basically the power mode, isn't it? You're taking away people's freedom. You're stopping them from doing what they want to do. And how do you know that 100 yards back in the queue of traffic is somebody who's just had a phone call from the hospital that their mother is dying and they need to get to the hospital quickly in order to talk to her before she passes away, and they're prevented from doing that? Yeah. So again, I'm not saying you should never ever do anything like that, but I'm very, very suspicious, very, very cautious of actions which target people, ordinary people, in that kind of way and sort of take away their freedom. It's a bit like you're taking them hostage. Of course, it's not morally the same as a terrorist taking someone hostage, because you're not threatening their life, but you're taking away their freedom and you're using them as a kind of pawn in order to then force the authorities to come and arrest you and so on. So it's a straight use of power and manipulation, and I'm very, very kind of suspicious of that kind of thing. And I was involved in C&D in the 80s, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which, there was a lot of direct action, but it was always things like blocking the entrances to missile bases. So you weren't kind of targeting people in that kind of way. You were doing actions which were symbolic, which targeted the thing that we were against, and they were highly kind of symbolic actions and very, very effective. They really did draw attention to that. So yeah, I know that you discussed this very well in your book, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of chuck that in.
Thank you. So yeah, first of all, to say, in the case of blocking the M25, I have my sort of, my doubts about that. Personally, what I would say is there was a discussion within Extinction Rebellion about that, and that is not an Extinction Rebellion protest, just to be clear about that. It's not under the auspices of Extinction Rebellion. I'm cautious about blocking public transport in general, because I think it sends out, it's not the message I want to send out. I want people to use public transport. I mean, sometimes there was the Canning Town DLR action that blocked public transport. Yeah, I'll just pause there.
Well, I'm just thinking, I had some involvement with anti-apartheid activism in South Africa growing up. And I think there are two things that, like really sort of headlines, that I would take away from what I learned in those experiences. The one is that no one thing that any one person can do at any one time is adequate to the nature of the problem. So I think there's a sort of kind of panic or that can come up, thinking that at any one moment in time the response to the whole situation is dependent on what I do now, which is not the same thing as staying in the burning house. Mm-hmm. But I think there's something really important about kindness and developing collective action that focuses also on the fact that these systems are big. And not one thing is going to solve it. We can kind of get into a slightly heroic mode that I think isn't very good for us or for collective action. And I think the other thing would be a kind of means and ends question. It's very easy to build hatred into the very activism that's trying to resolve the problems that we're attending to. So I think there's something, one of the ways we can think about what Sangharakshita was doing is he talks about the new society, like trying to develop positive nodes that are based on different kinds of values. And so that's one option, is let's see what we can build that is of a different nature from the problem that we're addressing and see what that can lead to. But the other is about really attending to our relationships. So you're talking about that in a way, in terms of your relationship with the people who might be impacted by what you do, but also not splitting, not creating kind of enemy dialogues. You speak about that as well. So that certainly isn't an answer to what to do, but I think how we do what we do is really fundamental to the long-term effects of the actions that are involved.
Two really helpful points. Thanks, Dhammamegha. Can I just talk a little bit about the Quakers? Because I think it is, I've been interested in this issue of Triratna and politics and how do we get involved in these big issues in the world. And, even in Triratna, it can be quite polarized, can't it? People have very different views. Some people think it's really important we get involved. Some people think, no, we mustn't get drawn into worldly values. We must sort of stand apart and do something different. So I've been really trying to think about this, and one thing I thought was I'll read about the Quakers, the history of the Quakers, because they have a very proud legacy, and rightly so, for their involvement in many social issues, particularly the anti-slavery issue. And many of them were leaders in the anti-slavery movement. Many of them helped with the helped slaves escape from southern states to the free northern states by hiding them and helping them to make that transition and so on. So a rightly proud legacy that they've got. They made a difference as a spiritual community. But when you look at the history of it, it was, of course, much, much more complicated. And it was very, very divisive in the Quaker community. So there was about a 40-year period where they were debating slavery, and many of them were slave owners themselves, but they gradually achieved a consensus against slavery, and Quakers were really kind of urged to free their slaves and so on. But then there was another 40-year period, so it's a long time, not just a few years debate, but decades, where this community was sort of grappling with this issue, and they basically kind of split into two factions. So one were, they just felt, the kind of principles and practices of Quakerism were really important. And they feared that getting drawn into political change would compromise things, such as the Quaker commitment to non-violence. So they were the kind of gradualists. They just wanted to try and change the culture gradually. And then there were I think they were called the come-outers, which were the more kind of radical ones who wanted to kind of insist on change more quickly and got much more involved in political campaigning. And it was very, very polarized. It even kind of contributed to a kind of split in the Quaker tradition in America. So I think that's a very, very interesting history for us. And I suppose one of the lessons I draw from that was, did they need to polarize between those two factions? Is there a way of seeing that actually those two things can actually contribute to each other rather than play against each other? yes, some people are going to stay more within a spiritual community and really kind of create community and really teach those values and so on. And then some people are going to go out into the world and try and change things. And if you choose one or the other, both of them involve compromise. So there were ways, the ones that politically campaigned did in compromise, it did lead to war. It led to civil war. And some Quakers ended up getting involved in military conflict. So you could see the point of view of the ones who were saying you're just going to compromise Quakerism. But then again, if you just stand apart from the world and stay pure, that's another compromise, isn't it? It's just a compromise of a different kind. You're reducing your ability to be of service to the world and have an effect in the world. So I think that's the dilemma for a small spiritual community. What you can do is actually limited. Your own ways and methods aren't necessarily going to change the world, but you can still contribute in a particular kind of way. Through the values that you're holding, the practices that you're teaching, and through creating community. I mean, I think community is going to become more and more an absolute kind of crucial, vital thing that we've got. That's something that we can offer the world, being part of a community. When people are feeling frightened and isolated and despairing, you need connection, you need community. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that Quaker history has got quite a lot to teach us, actually.
It's very interesting, isn't it? I was just thinking, wouldn't it be great if we could have a is it right word, heterogeneous as opposed to homogeneous movement, where there's so many different things happening. It's like we're not all trying to agree, but actually we are in dialogue over the issue. So there's a line, isn't there, between dispute and schism and very lively engaged debate. And in a way, I think for any spiritual movement to stay alive, it needs to be right on that edge of engaged debate, because to stop doing that basically is to sort of congeal in some way, isn't it? And to sort of lose that question of how do we live our values in this world? And that's a unique question at any moment in time, isn't it? We've always got very particular issues. So yeah, exciting if we can hold that between us.
Yeah, so we do have in our tradition, in Triratna, we do have history, and we do have grounding for this kind of discussion, and it's in the White Lotus Sutra. It's a Sutra of Golden Light, where Bhante, that is Sangharakshita, talks about transforming self and world. So there are two poles to the discussion, as you were saying, Vajragupta, that there's transforming oneself and there's also transforming the world. And these are not separate. If you go deeply into transforming yourself, then you come out in transforming the world. And if you go deeply into transforming the world, you'll come back to transforming yourself. The question is, how can us be involved in social change without buying into the current political structures? I don't identify with the current political structures. Unfortunately, I never have. Maybe that's why I'm a Buddhist. It's because I found no home there in the current political structures. So I've had to look elsewhere. And I'm very deeply passionate about social change without a political, political home, at least in this country. Yeah. So that's the kind of questions. That's where I'd like to look. Though, to engage fully in social change without supporting a particular political party. I don't see that as necessarily as a way forward.
So I'm aware it's 12:25, and it feels like we're only, we're still only just getting into the beginnings of the conversations. And I think, the title of this was Buddhism, the Environment and You. And in a way, there are two things I'd like to reflect on in this. The one is that I think one of the things we wanted to do with this panel was also be able to have these conversations without just agreeing about everything. And we've got here people who are all involved in very different ways, who are all having an effect at different levels and different ways in what we're doing. So we've gone through the whole process of, let's say, self and world in terms of that. And the other, of course, is that leaves each of us with our own relationships, internal and external, our own love for the world, and our own responsibility to work out at this point in time what to do. And that'll have different degrees of urgency at different times. So I hope that what we've done in the panel has been enough food for thought to be able to think through what to do and how to do it without any promises of some heroic resolution. Because I think there's a real danger in sort of banner waving in that way, because it's complex, isn't it? It's complex. And the heat will be turned up or turned down in our lives in different ways, in our communities in different ways. So it feels a little bit unsatisfactory, I have to say, to have to leave it there, because in a way, we could carry on with this, and we will. I don't mean we necessarily, but in this community and in these various forms, we'll carry on. But we have finished the panel for now. Yeah. So thank you all very much for your thoughtfulness and bringing yourselves in, and the accumulated wisdom and care of what you're doing. And what we're going to do now, there will be some time afterwards downstairs for people to chat to the people on the panel. I know there hasn't been that much chance for a broader conversation, and Shantigarbha's got his book, including The Burning House, for sale downstairs as well. But what we're going to do now, after that, thank you, is that Carolyn's going to come up over here. Here comes Carolyn. Thank you, Maitridevi. And Carolyn is going to basically do the last bit of this, which is a bit of an appeal to support Windhorse Publications to keep publishing in this area and others. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Dhammamegha. When I was thinking about how we might begin this conversation, I looked at my Dharma bookshelf, and without exception, all my books were published by Windhorse. Hooray!
All of them?
Yeah, maybe I haven't got enough.
You can get others too.
And every book that's helped me understand the Dharma and change my life has been thanks to you, Windhorse. And I thought, well, what would it be like without Windhorse? Because they produce books that inspire and guide us. And also they're trusted because of the lineage, because of the fact that they're part of the community. So how does Windhorse help us to see and respond to our modern world through a Dharmic perspective?
Well, basically, I've got two parts to my job. I'm the publishing director. So one part is I help run the business, and I spend an awful lot of time on operational matters. But the other is that we're responsible for commissioning new books. And one of the ways I've been thinking about this myself is in terms of what we commission is, I think, like, we want to take the tradition seriously. We want to take the practices seriously. And in a way, I wish we'd had more time today to talk about the 4 or 6 element practice. I think that would have been quite helpful, and maybe we can follow up with that. But we want to take the practices seriously. We want to take the practitioner seriously. Like, what actually is the nature of the human being who is practicing? Who are we that we practice? And then we want to take the context that we're living in seriously. So that includes the environment, the social context. And I think we're guided in what books we, I get loads and loads of books sent to me all the time to publish. And what do we choose? Every time we choose a book, we're kind of bringing a spotlight on a sustained engagement and hopefully resources on these issues. So actually one of the books we're looking at the moment is in terms of racism as well. But there are lots of social and environmental issues that we can address, as well as very traditional Buddhist practice that grounds what kind of responses we can have. So that's one way we can keep publishing books. That would be good.
How's lockdown been for you?
Lockdown was a blast for Windhorse Publications. So Windhorse has been around since 1974. And it used to be that mostly we sold via bookshops like the one downstairs, like 60–70% of our books were sold that way. And of course, all the bookshops closed. And we didn't have a lot of finances, actually. We didn't have a lot of resources behind us. And for a little while at the beginning of the first lockdown, it also looked like our distributor and printer were going to have to close. And if that were to be the case, then we would go under. We would have survived another 2 months, perhaps, because we wouldn't actually have been able to sell books. So it was really funny, actually. Our team got together and we were like, okay. So if we're going to go down, then let's go down doing what we're here for, which is to share the Dharma. So we started this Free the Dharma campaign. I don't know if some of you got some free ebooks last year.
Yes.
So the great thing was actually we gave all of this Dharma away, and then people came to our website and started buying other books and made donations. And and we've got loads more connections. Loads of people have approached us with new books. So in a weird it was a bit like actually that thing of being vulnerable, isn't it? Being out of control, being vulnerable. And we it was lovely for us as a team to be able to keep doing what we were there to do. So it was one of those lovely moments where we turned around. So actually we're in a very good position at the moment, actually. We've got lots of new books coming in. We're financially stable. We've cleared up our operations a little bit. We've got some great new ideas. So actually we're in a healthy state and growing at the moment.
You receive financial support from Fujidarma. What does the grant enable you to do, and why is that important?
So Fujidarma Fund, who are co-hosting this event, raise funds for various initiatives in our community. And we actually get a grant from the beginning of this year for £28,000, which is a lot for us. Our overall income is about 300,000, so it's almost 10% of what we're funding. And they're funding us to go big. So what that's meant actually is an extra day of time for me. I was employed 4 days a week and can't do it. So now I'm employed full time, and we've got a marketing person, and it also helps us to keep books that would otherwise go out of print back in print. And it gives us the confidence to commission some books where we don't know how well they're going to sell, but they're things that we really want to put our weight behind. So that current grant is for 3 years if we keep going okay. So that's what they're supporting.
Great, thank you. So all donations from this morning's event are to go to Windhorse, and we are aiming to raise £1,500 to support Windhorse's wonderful work as they expand the production and distribution of Dharma books. Now, some examples of what your gift can make happen. So £50 can widen our audience for a new book release quite significantly. With £100, we can design a book cover or do a trade advert. And the £1,500, which is what we're trying to raise today, would commission a new book. So please, if you haven't given already, please give generously, because they are a most wonderful resource. If you're watching this on Zoom or YouTube, there is a link in the chat. So I encourage you to do it now. Don't walk away and think about it. Do it now. And if you're here and you'd like to make a donation, Ya Sheng and Chrissy are going to be manning the computer downstairs, and anything that you can give, we'd be very grateful for. Thank you so much.
So I wonder, thanks, Carolyn. Do you want to come back, Maitridevi? We can all hang out. I thought this is not the end, is it? But I wondered whether it would be quite nice for us maybe the four of us collectively could lead the transference of merit and self-surrender well, I suppose in honor of the fact that what we're doing is attempting to bring about a saner life and a saner world for us all. So if we can just do a collective transference of merit and self-surrender. Fit in where you can if you don't know it by heart. May the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. My personality throughout my existences, my possessions, and my merit in all three ways, I give up without regard to myself for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which maintains all beings, situated throughout space, so long as all have not attained to peace. So thank you for all of those who are at home, who've joined us via Zoom and YouTube. We'll end our morning for you now. And thank you to North London, to the Ratnaprabha, to Fujidarma Fund for initiating this day. And most especially, thank you to the three of you for your questions and your answers and your thinking.